Good afternoon. I'm Senator Nancy Skinner. I represent Senate District 9, which is the East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley, Richmond, San Leandro, so many other cities along the I-80 corridor. And I'm really, really pleased to be able to host this opportunity for us to hear from some very powerful leaders who I think will help us understand I'll say the moment we're in, but we're really not in a moment. This is painfully way too repetitive. But I think as Dr. Noha, who I'm about to introduce, has pointed out to me, the difference right now, it's the first time we've ever experienced it in the middle of a pandemic. I just want to say that what I'm going to do is introduce some great people and turn it over to them and let them speak. And then I'm going to facilitate some issues that have been brought up from my constituents to let those leaders just respond how they choose to respond, and then let them close. And I know that lots of people are looking for solutions right now, and we could have this entire discussion be about solutions. But really, I thought, in a way, it's very, very complex, what we have been dealing with now for hundreds of years. We're watching a moment, and we're dealing with it again. And there are solutions that we need to pursue. There are reforms. But before I spend an hour or many, many hours on a particular solution, I think we just have to step back and try to understand the complexity of it and just hear from some folks. And I know many people have been giving this thought for years. But I just tell you, as a white person, I learn something every day. And so I just want to give an opportunity for me to learn more and for all of us to learn more. So the folks that I have gathered here are the incredible Dr. Shirley Weber, Assembly Member from San Diego, Chair of the Black Caucus, and the author of AB 392, California's just very, very important change to use of force laws, and author of so much more and so much more accomplished, but I'll leave it at that. And then we will start with Dr. Shirley Weber. We will follow Dr. Weber with Cephas Johnson, who I met and I know as Uncle Bobby, who is Oscar Grant's uncle, and also the founder of the Love Not Blood campaign, and who in all the years I've been in the legislature has come to Sacramento again and again in support of laws for many, many reasons. And he has a perspective on the benefit of laws and then what else is needed. The laws are not the only answer, but he also has lots of other things that he can share with us. And then John Jones, who is a organizer here in Oakland, who was incarcerated at a young age. So he's directly system impacted and now works with the Dellum Institute. But I think I first met, John, when you were an organizer for Courage. Was that the first time or was it? Okay. But he's also been an organizer with Youth Alive and so much more. And then finally, Dr. Noha Aboelata, who likes to be referred to as Dr. Noha, who runs a clinic in East Oakland, the Roots Community Health Clinic, and was early on understood that this pandemic, of course, like everything else, disproportionately impacts Black residents, but unfortunately also poor people and people of color. And she got testing right away in East Oakland, but she has other things she'll want to share with us. So let me stop. Let me turn it over to Shirley. Excuse me, I call her Shirley because, of course, she is my friend and colleague, but Dr. Weber, more appropriate.
Shirley also, because that is my name.
Yeah.
It's good to be here with Senator Skinner, Nancy Skinner, who has been a friend of mine since I got into the legislature, a supporter during my campaign, but also a comrade in the struggle is what I call her, because we have fought so many issues together with regards to social justice, and she's a real trooper. And probably for anyone else, I'd have said no, because I've probably been, I don't know how many Zooms. I just got off one. I've been, I don't know how many Zooms since 2 o'clock. But let me just simply say that there are a lot of things we could talk about, and I try to figure out what is it that I can add to this conversation that might be a little bit different than everybody else, maybe a tiny bit different. I think probably my age is probably the one driving variable that makes my experience with this particular situation a little bit different. I was a teenager during the Watts riot and the Watts revolt at the time, and the National Guards were stationed in my front yard on 45th and Broadway. So I have a long history of looking at racial unrest, and I studied at Garvey as a doctoral student at UCLA and looked at the race riots of 1919 and the things that surrounded it before and after it, and continue to look at the continuing issue of race in this country. And what happens, as Langston Hughes asked when a dream is deferred, and in the end he says, or does it explode? And that is so very true. And that's what we see that occurs over and over again. And yet we never really deal with from each racial incident to the next. We get caught up in the issue of burning. People focus more on property, those kinds of things. And as a result, now buildings, we make sure that the buildings go back up, or some semblance of buildings in some communities. And we talk about that more than, and pretty soon we'll discover that we'll lose why we started the revolt. People can't remember why there was a Watts revolt. They don't remember what happened in terms of police brutality. And every racial incident that has come into a revolt has happened is because of some injustice that had occurred. And it was not just the one issue, it was a multitude of issues compounded on top of each other. And recently for the Black Caucus, we have a lot of folks now who want to help us solve this issue. And some of their help would divert us from where we need to go. And so I have resisted that particular theory of what they want to do. Because I said, until we deal with the issue of slavery and African Americans and what slavery did to the hearts and minds of people in this country, that seared their conscience with regards to the brutality that was heaped upon Black people, and it continues to be, then we're going to find ourselves always with African Americans being arrested more, being beaten more, being killed, and people not taking us seriously when they hear our issues. People were excited over this most recent issue because it was visible, it was there. There wasn't a way to explain it away. There wasn't a battle, there wasn't a wrestling with this guy, there wasn't anything people could see. He was handcuffed and cooperating. And all of a sudden, this man's face is on the ground with someone's knee in his neck, and he's killed, just like a public lynching that's occurred in the past. And so we have to deal with that. We have to deal with that as a part of the American psyche, because if we get caught up, people wanted us to write resolutions against bilingual education and this and this and this, and all those things are part of it. But until this country actually deals with what happened in slavery, what impact it had on those in terms of their legacy, their consciousness, what happened to whites in terms of their hearts being seared and their consciousness being taken away with regards to the brutality that Black people faced every day. If we don't deal with that, we will find ourselves forever in the cycle of thinking about it, praying about it, forgiving it, and moving on to the next incident that happens as a result of the compounded issues. So yeah, we have to do a lot of police reform, and I've done that, 392 and everything else. But we also have to grapple with the core issue in this country that really fuels the economic things, the social things, all those things, and the unwillingness to face the reality of what we have to face. We do it all the time. That's why African Americans have never gotten reparations in this country. There's never been an effort to make us whole, to give us back what they stole, at least to begin the process of doing that. And every other group has been given reparations, and it's never been recognized that what happened to us was brutal, unnecessary, and had a profound impact upon our lives. So we are working on that at the caucus. We have a reparations bill. We've done, and we also have an affirmative action bill. And we'll talk about that later.
Yes,
but
I might give you that opportunity, Dr. Weber.
Issue. And so that's where we are. And that's what I'm hoping people will focus on and begin to look at, rather than get caught up in the looting, the rioting, the fires. All those things are horrible. But we have to ask the critical question: what happens to a nation that allowed itself to get so far off that it could abuse someone the way this was done in such a most inhumane manner, and believe they could walk away from it. And only because somebody filmed it and taped it and the whole world saw it did we obviously stop and take note of it. And the question becomes, how long will we notice it?
Dr. Weber, as always, so eloquent. Yesterday, I was in the middle of Zoom meetings, and all of a sudden my husband yells out, quote of the day, quote of the day. And it was something you said. I don't have it in front of me, but my paraphrase when he told it to me was that you were quoted about the fact that America has taught white Americans for hundreds of years now to hate Black people. And it is grounded in every one of our institutions. And you said it far more eloquently than I just did, but it again is one of those eye openers for people like me that I have to confront and look at. Anyway, we will get back to you. Uncle Bobby.
First, I want to thank you, Senator Skinner, for opening the opportunity for me to be able to share on this platform and put a face on this issue. I am affectionately known to the community as Uncle Bobby. I'm the uncle of Oscar Grant, the young man murdered here in Oakland at the Fruitville BART station on January 1st, 2009. There is no horror comparable to losing a loved one to those you thought were here to serve and protect. And as my sister, Dr. Shirley Weber, shared about the importance of this, the power of the police to use deadly force is one of the most significant responsibilities we can give any public official. But that responsibility must be guided and protected in a sense that protects human life and save human rights. Our failure to do that puts us right where we're at today with the murder of George Floyd and what we see happening in our community. I am in a lot of pain in looking at that video, seeing my brother George being choked out the way he was, because many of us don't know that Tony Peroni had his knee on Oscar's neck, pushing his face through the platform, cracking the bones in his face, and choking him out, and he's saying he cannot breathe. We see this on the video every time I watch it. Because of the medical reports, I know what happened to his face. And then, of course, as we know, Johannes Mesley then shoots Oscar in the back and claims that he meant to use his taser. Much love goes out to my sister, Senator Nancy Skinner, for the simple fact of working with us to get SB 1421 passed. And I'm going to cite a couple of examples so that the listeners can understand just how significant that was and how some legislation can really be a tremendous deterrent to police violence in this country. During our trial with Johannes Mesley for the murder of Oscar Grant, we were aware of 4 incidents that he was involved in when it came to use of force. And the only reason why we were really aware of that was because the witnesses came forth to say that same police officer beat me up. And they filed complaints, but there was nothing done. 9 years, almost 10 years later, we are at the state capitol making an argument, thank God to my sister, Senator Nancy Skinner, put forth a bill called the Right to Know, SB 1421, which was going to give us an opportunity to take a look at an officer's personal record and what his history looked like. And so when that bill passed, every agency in the state of California fought for 6 months to keep for following the new law that was put in place. And then when we finally won that right to have that information, because it was an argument that it was prospective rather than retrospective, And so the argument was, what did the legislator truly mean? And so we in court constantly, and eventually it won out that it was retrospective rather than prospective, because prospective wouldn't have told us nothing but what was going to happen in the future. But retrospectives gave us a chance to look at the history of officers that are on the force today. And so I made my personal request, my family request. And in that report that came back, it shared with me that Johannes Mesley was in 6 use of force, or had 6 use of force complaints filed against him in 2008, right before he murdered Oscar Grant. So in many ways, that piece of legislation gives us an opportunity to identify bad actors, make a personal request to get that information, identify that officer, and then make the complaint to see if we can have that officer removed from the force, or at least restricted in a way that he can not harm someone. You know, I'm going to stick there, but I want to give a shout out to my sister, Dr. Shirley Weber, who also recognized how important a piece of legislation was in dealing with that type of act when it came to AB 392, which we officially got passed on January 1st, 2020, which Gavin Newsom signed into legislation on August 19th of 2019. However, we don't have the data yet to say it's working, but what we do know is that the agencies are fighting like hell again to not abide by the new law for this state of California when it comes to use of force being applied to a civilian. So we have an agency on a regular, consistent basis bucking on the issue of common sense legislation. So now we have to try to understand why. I mean, historically, when we go back in time, if we really can comprehend what's going on, we know that the policing agencies developed from paddy rollers or night watchers, which was slave patrollers at that time that morphed into the policing department that we have today. So they brought this mindset, this cultural thinking into the policing that we see today. And so I'm gonna give some numbers. I'm not sure how much time I left, but I'm gonna give these numbers. Since the murder of Oscar Grant, in the state of California alone, we have had over 1,200 civilians killed by police. On a national level, we average 1,000 to 1,200 folks being killed by the police every year. That means since the murder of Oscar Grant, we have had 15,000 people in the United States killed by the police. It's obvious that there is a major problem when there's that many people being killed and nobody held accountable. So since the murder of my nephew, I've made it my life work to first try to embrace a family that's been impacted by this pain, to help them find some direction and method to move forward to get justice, but also to do what I can to at least attempt to decrease that murdering number that we see happening on a regular basis. And so I do want to say AB 71, the use of force data collection, gave us the proof that what we say was happening was happening. And for all the listeners out there, those that are watching, AB 71, you should take a look at. AB 953, we wanted to identify whether it was racial or not, and we began to look at it in that way, which is the Racial Identification Profiling Act, which was really critical. Now we know that there is racism within the force and the way people are stopped. And of course, 2018, by my sister, Senator Skinner, we got 1421 passed. That gives us an opportunity to look at the sexual crimes that an officer perpetrate on the people they stop. We also had a chance to look at the falsification of police records, and also whether they've been involved in a shooting, whether they killed or not. You know, these are important aspects. And then, of course, in 2019, we got AB 748, the audio and video release, because every time someone is killed, the agency has a tendency to not want to share the video that can help us calm down whether the person was actually involved in a criminal act or not. But most of the time, what we find is that the information they keep from being, that keeps them from being transparent, is because it is a real questionable shooting that normally leads to the fact that the person that was killed should have never been killed, like George Floyd. And of course, the last one, and I'll go ahead and turn it, Senator Skinner, is AB 392, which only talks about de-escalation tactics. If an officer violates in any kind of way, criminality can be applied, right? The concern about the totality of the event. So instead of just looking at the shooting and then saying he looked like he was reaching for a gun, what participated or what happened before that shooting occurred that can give us a clear understanding of what happened, and of course, whether an officer's been involved in a shooting or not. And there's so much more I can go into, but I know I don't want, for the sake of other speakers that we have, I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cephas, Uncle Bobby. And I would love for you, if you choose to, completely up to you. At the end, you gave a great interview recently on KGO, and you referenced in that interview, it's something that I first learned from my own colleague, Senator Steve Bradford, something I had never learned. Again, it's that thing of all of this. I'm sure many of the people listening know this, but I didn't know that the very institution of police departments came about to capture runaway slaves. That was the purpose. I didn't understand that. Senator Steve Bradley pointed that out. You brought it up in your interview, but you also brought up in that interview that even with all your involvement in laws, that you have a new perspective that laws alone are not enough. But that I'll leave to you. But let me turn now to John Jones. John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I want to start by thanking you, Senator Skinner, as well as your office, for this opportunity for us to share. And I do want to apologize in advance. I was experiencing internet issues, so I moved to a different part. So hopefully everything is clear for now. I just want to make a few points as part of my opening comments. George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." We know that's something that Eric Garner experienced and countless others. And I think for me, it's important to start there because we know the act of breath is not just a simple matter of the intake of air, right? It allows us to oxygenate our brains. This is the issue of trauma. And in trauma, there should always be room and space for people to feel, to be. We need to be in this moment and we need to feel emotionally because what we're experiencing, once again, as we have been sharing, this isn't an isolated phenomenon, right? It's a long history of state-sanctioned violence that has besieged communities of color and Black people specifically for far too long. I also want to share that it's so important to me as a Black man and a single father. I have 3 sons, 2 of them I'm raising by myself. Black men need space to share. I don't watch the media often, but it was interesting when I did watch bits and pieces. Rarely, if ever, do I recall seeing a Black man speak because we're seeing people who look like us murdered. And it seemed like the only time our lives truly have value is when we're dead and even then killed by a cop. Many of us live in communities where the reality of death is ever present, regardless of who's the perpetrator. I do want to add, for example, in East Oakland on Monday, there were 3 people murdered, including a 15-year-old. The first homicide in Oakland this year was a 17-year-old. Why am I naming this? Because for me, I define state-sanctioned violence as not just when police do it. I also include community violence for this standpoint because of a lack of resources and intentionality when it comes to disrupting these cycles that are created by systemic things. And for those on the ground doing the work, not receiving sufficient funding at a time where law enforcement agencies are disproportionately receiving too much money. So for me, there's a human toll and there's also a fiscal and budgetary impact that is so very real and crucial that I feel should also be a part of this conversation. I also want to share that I'm someone who has experienced police brutality in Oakland, including being 12 years old, the first time I was slammed against a wall and called the N-word. And mind you, my mother family's from Louisiana. Racism was something read in a book. I never thought I would have a white cop, let alone anyone, call me the N-word. Having 2 of my childhood This has
John, your internet's cutting out.
about now.
Okay, so yeah, talk now. Let's see. We're not hearing you. Let's give John a moment to see if he comes back. Otherwise, in a minute, we can turn to Dr. Noha and then return to John. Dr. Noha, oh. Dr. Noha, would you like to begin and then we can return back to John when you are finished?
Absolutely. And I hope we can, because I really am enjoying listening to all of you and just honored to be here with you all. Thank you, Senator Skinner. Yeah, the police murder of a Black man in this country is nothing new. I think that's what others have said. It's not new and it's not even infrequent. Just a little bit over a month ago, right here in our backyard in San Leandro, Stephen Taylor was shot in the back by police at Walmart, murdered while he was apparently in the midst of a mental health crisis. And we have tragic example after tragic example that reminds me that this is really a sickness that's as old as this country. And so I have been asking myself, and Senator Skinner, you alluded to this earlier.
Dr. Noha, we've lost you also.
We're in the middle of a pandemic, and yet Black men are still being murdered by police. It's like the most brutal and in-your-face reminder that systemic racism and all of its ugly manifestations are alive and well. Right? If you can't even take a break in the midst of a pandemic, then nobody should be under any illusion about its ever-presence. And because of the economic shutdown, the pandemic, all the fallout, we're kind of already in this state of uncertainty, of fear, of anxiety about the future, of information overload. We have so many people that are in a sort of a deepening state of economic insecurity and instability. And so even prior to George Floyd's murder, we were already seeing people struggling with exacerbations in anxiety and depression, relapsing into drinking or substances. We know about increasing violence within households and on the streets. And I've been saying that because of the pandemic, we're kind of experiencing, maybe for the first time, a kind of collective world trauma. And that is something that's brand new. I think the other thing that feels new is sort of the way that we're witnessing the crime. We can't unsee the imagery of watching a man's life experienced. And so for every person who's lost someone to murder, witnessed a murder, experienced police brutality, witnessed police brutality, and now I'm talking about a big portion of our community, right? This is absolutely triggering. It compounds existing trauma, and it leads to more behavioral health crisis. And behavioral health crisis is not something we deal with well in this country at all, period. I mean, for anyone, really. But especially as it relates to Black men. Mental health conditions are often under-recognized, misdiagnosed, inappropriately addressed, over-medicated, and criminalized. And, you know, here in Alameda County, which is really not unlike many other counties across the country, the largest mental health provider is the county jail. And Black men are dramatically overrepresented there and throughout the criminal justice system. And so here we have yet another example, in addition to police murder, in addition to the legal tolerance of that murder, in addition to redlining. And I could go on and on about, more examples, but these are all examples of how structurally racist systems upon which this country was built continue to feed themselves and maintain the status quo. And that status quo includes major life expectancy differences. It includes intractable health disparities. It includes enormous income gaps, disproportionate death rates from COVID. I mean, just I list a whole host of other outcomes that are tragically predictable. And so it was really all of that sort of knowledge and understanding that Roots Community Health Center was founded in the first place. And for me, Roots is sort of living proof that communities can build from within. We can create meaningful opportunities. We can engage in meaningful partnerships to uplift our own people, our own community. We can deliver our own services that are appropriate and culturally responsive. We can build our own workforce enterprises that will hire you regardless of what the system has on you. And so Roots is our community, from the people we serve to the frontline staff, to the leadership, to the board. So believe that we're all really struggling right now, our whole team, So after this past weekend, with all of the unrest and the pandemic and the economic fallout and all of that just sort of like really weighing me down, Monday morning when I drove up to Roots, I can't tell you how it was just like medicine to me, to my soul. Just seeing all of our people suited up in their PPE, getting ready to serve, preparing to put themselves at risk yet another day, like they've done every day since the beginning of this pandemic, providing COVID testing for our community. As you said, Senator Skinner, thank you for that. As odd as it may sound, it felt like a refuge to me. And so I don't know how much I have to contribute, in terms of a policy fix or solutions. And I just thank you for creating a space just to not even have to come to solutions, but to just talk about the issues. But I do have to express my deepest gratitude to each and every one of Roots family, which is over 120. Who are emerging, the unlikely allies that are emerging, the unlikely partnerships that are developing. And so that does give me hope for some type of a change to occur. So thank you.
You're welcome, Dr. Noha. And thank you so much for doing what you do with that community clinic and the services that you and all of your over 100 folks provide. And John, we're going to come back to you, but I think a lot of us, what we're experiencing, John, with the technical difficulties you just faced, the internet cutting in and out, imagine the children that are trying to learn this way, enough said. Anyway, John, go ahead.
Thank you again, Senator Skinner. And even though I may appear to take this lightly as a joke, but this is serious, the internet. The lack of connectivity as it relates to not only children being schooled from home, but just the ability to access information, even to learn about things like the recent curfew in Alameda County, for example. Yeah. So it just goes to show how there's different mechanism in play that contributes. I do want to wrap up by two last things. I know I started off by talking about the importance for Black men in particular to have a safe space to also share what these things look like to us and for us. Because as I shared before on the media, the only time I've seen Black men as it relates to the result of George Floyd being murdered by the cops is us looting. I really believe oppression exists when people are dehumanized, right? I want to add one last piece to the point of being formerly incarcerated. I've noticed that there's been a tendency through the media, for example, that when a Black person is murdered, more often than not, if there's even an article written, at the bottom, it will say something like such and such was in prison. To me, that's dog whistle politics. It's like it justifies it. I even heard that after George Floyd, for example, that someone said, oh, he was a violent criminal, as if that justified taking the life of another human being. So I think it's important that we have to look at all these factors. And I want to share this. I was tried as an adult when I was 16 years old. The point about police brutality and why it is so important for us to end it, because I want to go back to the fiscal impact as well. You know, in Oakland, for example, there was someone harmed by the police department and they received a $12 million settlement. I am not opposed to people receiving financial compensation for their harm, but we're also in the midst of a crippling housing crisis. And more often than not, law enforcement are funded with blank check, as it were. But when it comes to essential services in our community, like housing, employment, mental health, we're always told there's not enough money for that, or where we're going to find that money, right? So, and the last thing, going back to being incarcerated, that is also a form of state-sanctioned violence. I was 18 years old in Santa Rita when I seen the Rodney King riots, for example. I was in state prison when I first heard news of Oscar Grant being killed. And for me, what's so important in this moment is that it's not just remain a moment, that these don't represent another isolated moment, but let it become a movement to where we gather these moments together. First, giving space to folks to breathe, to exist, to be, to process. We cannot rush folks through that. I've seen that also with the Black people killed in a church by Dylan Roof. There was this tendency to come in and talk about prayer and forgiveness. No, let us feel first. People need to feel. So I want to say thank you for giving us an opportunity to be, to share, to feel.
Thank you. So we have a little less time for the discussion, but that's okay. I'll pose a few things and any of you who wish can respond if you choose to, and then we'll still allow your time for wrap up, maybe 2 minutes instead of 3, but don't worry. So one of the questions that some of my people sent in was, how can residents, and I think I'll speak for myself, how can white allies offer meaningful support to the movement for Black Lives Matter, to the effort to stop police-sanctioned violence, and the kinds of things we've been discussing? How can white allies play a meaningful role? Anyone who?
Well, I think I know that there's a role that can be played in the legislature, in the policy making. That's extremely important. The governor made a statement the other day that in his own press conference, he said, you know, this is not an African-American problem. He said, this is our problem, speaking of them. He said, you know, because basically he said, this is not of their making, this is of our making. And oftentimes people want us to do it all and to fight the battle, to create the policy, to do this, do that. And then, you know, when the rubber meets the road, you know, they have difficulty figuring out how they're going to vote for something, or how they're going to be supportive, or all those kinds of things. And as I said when we had, I think it was, I'm not sure whether it was Trayvon Martin or one of the things that we had happen. I said, please, please, please do not cry for me anymore. I am overwhelmed with your tears. You know, you need to do something. And if you can't vote for this bill, or you can't help with this, don't cry for me. I am tired of people crying for Black people. You know, and so oftentimes, and even now, as I'm battling these bills on the floor that need 54 votes, you know, I've got all these empathizers, sympathizers, people shocked and re-shocked. And yet I said, you want to know what to do? I said, you just push the button and say yes. Push the button that says yes, to give life to this legislation and those kinds of things. But people have a tendency to feel for you, to empathize, sympathize, but people have to recognize that change requires a sacrifice, period. There's only so much in the world. People talk about, you know, giving people power. Reality is there's only so much power. And sometimes we think, well, we can share the power and you can still have your 100 and I can have my 100. No, there's only 100 pounds of power in the world. And therefore, if I get some, you're going to have less, but that's okay. And people don't want to deal with that. They want to think that they can keep creating things when they still have theirs. And as a result, it doesn't move because they're always looking about what they're going to lose, even if they've stolen it from you. And so as a result, you know, people have to understand that change requires a sacrifice. And if you're not willing to put your time or your energy or even your vote or your resources into it, don't cry for people anymore because it's meaningless. And it's frustrating to me and others when people want to tell you how they feel so bad about what happened this last week. trying to figure out what to do. But there are 3 or 4 things you can do immediately as an elected official. And if you're afraid to do it and you don't have the courage, then you really aren't committed to it. And Maya Angelou says, without courage, it is impossible to live up to your values. And that is true. And so if you don't have the courage, because everybody's value at some point is going to cause them to have to stand up for something that they hadn't anticipated in their life. And so for me, if people want to do something, most of them have something they can do immediately. And they should do it and take the consequences and have the courage and then educate their population, educate their community about why they did what they did. But most people don't want to do that. They want to believe that there's some easy way that you can combat this issue. And the bottom line is there really isn't an easy way. It requires courage. And unless people are willing to do that and sacrifice, I tell them, don't cry for me anymore. I'm tired of these tears. I can't handle them no more. I'm wet from these folks' tears crying on me. I need people to act.
If I can jump in.
Yes, please.
I kind of heard the last part. I had to go get a plug. I didn't realize I didn't plug up my computer. So I missed the first part of the question, but the part that I did hear was the ideas of what white allies can do. But what was the first part of the question?
To offer meaningful support to the movement.
Right. So there are various organizations that are led by family members, like ours, for an example, Love Not Blood campaign. The support that we can get to continue to do the work that we do is extremely critical, because the last 10 years, we've traveled this country all the way even to London, working with families that's been impacted. And what we do is being impacted family members, we're able to embrace the family and begin to give them some source of hope and some source of guidance in their journey for justice. And so I think, recognizing that there are organizations out here that are truly doing the work has to be supported, because it's not sustainable just for a simple organization, we'll say like ours, just travel all around the world, think we can continuously do it. So of course, white money helps. But I think what's also important is how can our white allies also be in the movement itself? When Miles Hall was murdered in Walnut Creek, of course, we were called by the family and we went to embrace that family as we do. And what I saw was a white community in Walnut Creek embrace this Black family and give them the support that they need so that they can move forward in their journey to get justice. And I don't know if the listeners are aware who Miles Hall was, but he was in a mental crisis state. Yes. He was killed by the Walnut police. And so this issue concerning those that are killed by the police in a mental crisis percent in 2015, I remember it's 56% of the police murders had to do with a person in a mental crisis state. So of course, our white allies first, and just white folks have to understand the initial criminalization of the Black man, the dehumanization of the Black man, and even the demoralization of the Black man takes place. So we can't always buy into that. That's what's going to happen with George Floyd. They're going to criminalize him, eventually dehumanize him, and eventually demoralize him so that we can think that he should not get the justice and those officers should not go to jail. But the same thing also happens with the protests. Most protests are peaceful protests about the cause. But there are agents that work within the protest that has the media begin to focus on the looting and so-called rioting that takes place when it's actually a rebel to an issue concerning an injustice. And what happens with that, the protest now becomes criminalized, demoralized, and dehumanized for the simple tactic of keeping white folks from becoming involved. Right? And so we have to be clear that there are tactics that are used by design to create the impression that Blackness was acting in such a way that is a justifiable homicide and that you need not be a part of that. I always say to my white allies, you can help put on a Black Lives Matter shirt. Wear an Oscar Grant shirt in your community and take the heat and stand up and speak on behalf of Black Life Does Matter. And in that respect, now you are talking to your folks that you know that are in silos or circles that is like, I don't even know why they protesting. Or look at them, they protesting and they rioting. That is not how it always starts. But that's what end up being the conversation rather than the issue that is at hand. You know, we've been doing this for years. We've been to every major protest in this country. And I heard the doctors say this is happening during a pandemic. What happens during all crisis issues? Katrina, for example, Black folks were devastated by what happened. And then the police went on a rampage and killing Black folks. All we got to do is take a look at the history. And then we can begin to understand some of the tactics that are used to create the divide that takes place or the lesson to support. It's a game changer when we have white folks seeing an injustice and speaking on behalf of Black males, brown males, red males, or who, I mean, not just males, you know, women too, children also. It's a game changer. And what we see, what happened with Floyd and the protests going on all around this country, it is a game changer. So it makes things more optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. Not only that, it does open the door for us to move the pendulum forward with legislation that can hold officers accountable. Because what's going to fix this whole thing is accountability. And those officers that was there also should be held, because what that'll do is put in an officer's mind that this is a bad character, beating up somebody he shouldn't be beating up, or they'll shot somebody, and I'm not going to falsify my report. I'm not going to stand behind him and condone what he did, because I can go to jail behind his act, and now we have that blue code of silence now broken. Accountability, and those that are accessory to it held accountable, will change the whole game.
Thank you, Cephas. Now, before we go to your letting some folks make last comments, John or Dr. Noha, do you want to comment on whether you think, is this time that we can harness this window to make further progress? Do you see that opportunities there? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I go. Absolutely. I always share this. I mean, without hope, without faith, I wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning. We have to believe that things can change. I mean, that's part of our nature as human beings and how we advance and move through society. And this moment is a pivotal moment that provides an opportunity, because we're seeing the generation of attention of people being involved in a way that is, in some aspects, unique, I want to share. You know, so it's important for us, when I say us, all of us as members of a shared beloved community, to be involved, to mobilize, to educate ourselves, to understand how we can dismantle this. That's how we turn the how into a will. So yes, it's absolutely possible. I just want to throw this as a reminder. I mean, they're doing the issues of slavery. There were people who thought that that wouldn't end. And there were people who fought for that for a long time. Every systemic issue, women's suffrage, civil rights movement, et cetera, right? I do want to just add something real quickly, and I'll pass it off. The subject of white allyship. Just want to say something real quickly. I want white people in particular to not see themselves as an accessory to this issue. White people, you have not just a vital role in this, but an inherent responsibility. Because more often than not, a lot of these actions are, quote unquote, done on the behalf of white people. I'm not saying white people in America are saying that, but the way things play out is implied. So we need white people to stand up and say, this does not speak for me, right? Speak through your vote, speak through donating to and supporting those who are already on the ground doing the work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Last thing I want to offer is this. It is great to go to a protest. The reality is we don't need people coming into Oakland for a protest. The awareness is already here. We need to raise that awareness in other communities, El Cerrito, Albany, Kensington, right? We need white allies to organize in your community, because you have a level of access and privilege that we do not share, right? Use your access and privilege to not only generate awareness with your neighbors and with your family members, but with your coworkers, with your elected officials. This should not just be seen as a Black problem, because once it's done that way, what it does, it mitigates the responsibility. And as Uncle Bobby pointed out, like all the inherent things with that, dehumanization, criminalization, et cetera, et cetera. Now is the moment for all of us. I'm gonna wrap up on this. A lot of us, especially in these liberal places and regions like the Bay Area, right, we are enamored with saying things like Trump don't speak for us. This is not the time for words. It's a time for actions. We're long due. So this is an opportunity for people to actively exercise those values that gave our beloved region the historical legacy as being the vanguard for social justice.
Thank you, John. And I do not want those who are watching or listening to think that I am assuming that everyone listening to this is white or that all my constituents are. By no means. But it was a question that was submitted, so it's why I raised it. And what I have been particularly encouraged by is to see all across the country, and of course here at home in SD9, that the reactions and the responses, the protests have been everyone. They have not only been the Black community. So that is very heartening. It gives me, I mean, I think we are getting a stronger awareness, a stronger understanding. And whether that was through the misfortune of having the person who's the illegitimate occupant of the White House right now that helped more people wake up, I don't really know. But there is, I think, more. But before I turn it over to Dr. Weber to talk about some of the things that Black Caucus has introduced, I want to give Dr. Noha the ability to share any final thoughts. And I think it's, I do, and you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. You can whatever you want to address. But I do think people are trying to figure out. Okay, is this because, as you have all mentioned, this is not new. The violence against the police violence against Black people and the response to protests that we've seen and the calling of curfews and all that. This is not new. But so again, I always have optimism. I wouldn't be in my job if I wasn't trying to, but do we see openings for, something more significant in terms of change? But again, Dr. Noha, please address whatever you're comfortable with, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Weber. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think to your earlier point that this is not going to be an easy solution. And I would want to encourage everyone not to dismiss this as a police officer, or we're not all like that, or we can't do that. That I think we have to acknowledge, we absolutely have to acknowledge that police murder, the legal system's tolerance of that murder, and all of the structurally racist policies that we have in this country are really what the country was actually founded and built upon. So in order to dismantle that, this is not one easy fix type of thing. And so I think at first it does take that acknowledgement that, and that we all have a role to play, and we all need to be playing a role to try to dismantle and to counter that, or to at least hold accountability. Within whatever your corner of your world is, whatever your space that you're in, hold accountability to the systems that you're part of or that you can influence. I think to John's point, so don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. Don't feel like you have to come in and impose a solution. Listen to ground, listen to what people impacted are saying, and help uplift those solutions. And so I think in that way, that is acknowledging that's not an easy solution. Not just in that one-off situation, and really respecting and uplifting what is working on the ground is how we can each play a part, I think, in progress and in change.
Thank you. So we don't really have time to go back to everyone for closing. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Weber now, because I know the Black Caucus had an event Tuesday where they outlined some things that, and of course, Dr. Weber's chair of California's Legislative Black Caucus. And I give her this opportunity not again to raise these as the only solutions or that this forum is about solutions, but rather just to be a source of information of some action that the Black Caucus in the state of California's legislature is putting before us and asking us to consider. And Dr. Weber, and then I will say goodnight to folks, but go ahead, Dr. Weber.
Yes, very quickly. We had a press conference. Anyone who wants to look at our website can see all of the things as well as hear the press conference itself concerning the things that we talked about. But there are two things that are really important because they're coming up this week. And one of them is ACA 5, which is a bill to repeal Proposition 209, to reinstate affirmative action in the state of California so that race and gender can be considered variables in education, contracting, and in employment. Those are things that are very important that we fought for in the 60s. We had it until we got rid of it in California in 1995, I believe it was. And so we want to reinstate that because after 24 years, we realized that we have lost a lot in terms of opportunities, employment, economics, you name it. So we have a huge coalition, much of it based out of the Bay Area, but a lot in Southern California, to put this on the ballot in November. It requires 54 votes in the Assembly, 27 votes in the Senate. So we're working very hard to get to that 54 vote, and it will have to be voted on this week. The other bill that we have is a bill for reparations, AB 3121. And that would basically establish a commission in California to talk about reparations and the impact of slavery on those who live in California and California's role in supporting slavery through the fugitive slave laws and the insurance policies and so forth and so on. And that commission to come back and to provide us with recommendations that of things that California has to do to begin to heal Californians as a result of slavery. We see this as critical to moving forward, to dealing with the issues that we're dealing with now and moving forward with every other group. So AB 3121 is a reparations bill. The federal government has been trying to pass one for 20 years. They've not been able to. We have gotten it out of all the committees in the Assembly, and it will be on the Senate floor. Our assumption is that bill will pass this week, and we'll take it over to the Senate and then get the development of a commission. But that's ACA 5. That is a tremendous effort on the part of all of us, of all the caucuses, 250 some odd groups and organizations supporting that bill. And of course, AB 3121, reparations.
And Dr. Weber's ACA is Mr. McCarty's bill that would give people on parole the right to vote. Is that, go ahead, is that one going to come up?
It's in the Senate, and your President Pro Tem has yet to set it for a hearing. She's concerned of whether or not he has enough votes. I think he has 26 of the 27 votes committed, and but it hasn't even been set for a committee yet. Right. And so that's a real problem with that one. Pressure on the Senate, on the President Pro Tem would hopefully get it set for a committee so it can move forward. Yes.
Yes. And the Congressional Black Caucus website, there's a variety of other bills. People can go to that website and look. Go ahead, Dr. Weber.
The California Legislative Black Caucus.
Sorry, I said congressional. I'm thinking about our good colleague, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's very pivotal in the Congressional Black Caucus. But no, you're absolutely right. It's the California Legislative Black Caucus. That is the website where you can get the full list of these bills and weigh in and communicate to elected officials. I don't know if I'm listed as co-author yet on some of those, but I clearly I am absolutely in support of.
If not, we can always add you. You
yes, know that. Thank you. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for being willing to join this, to be out there, to share your very important thoughts. And I want to thank you especially because I do not want to be constantly turning only to Black leaders to carry all the burden of these issues. But I thought that at this moment, it is so important to hear from Black leaders so that we can understand, we have better insight because of your lived experience. And clearly, many of my constituents have this same lived experience. So it is not unique or unusual at all for many of my constituents. And I learn every day from them, as I learn from you each and every day, and do my best to try to incorporate that in the role that I play as the state senator. And I just want, again, to thank each of you. And I support your work, and you can call on me anytime. And I will close just by indicating that I am committed to being loud and clear and standing up for and fighting for Black lives, because Black lives matter. And in any way that I can continue to be a strong ally, I look forward to your bringing to my attention ways that I can add my leadership, my voice to that. And thank you for allowing to participate in this forum and giving this opportunity for everyone who is listening to hear it and share. Thanks very much. And with that, we'll close, and thank my staff for organizing it too. Okay.